A prejudiced female officer detains a black woman, only to find out she is an undercover FBI agent. What unfolds when justice is challenged? What occurs when bias clashes with reality? This narrative takes you on a compelling journey of authority, responsibility, and the bravery to transform. It was a typical day, serene and quiet, just how Emily Davis preferred it. She sat by herself on an old wooden bench, a paperback book in one hand and a take-out coffee cup in the other. The surroundings blurred into the background as she immersed herself in the story, cherishing a rare moment of tranquility away from the intense demands of her role as an FBI agent. She had learned early on to value these moments, to seize them whenever possible, because they never lasted long. Unbeknownst to her, she had already drawn the attention of Officer Laura Bennett from across the park. Laura's keen eyes locked. Onto Emily, her instincts buzzing. Laura had patrolled this park for years and took pride in sensing when something was amiss. Today, that feeling struck her the instant she noticed Emily sitting there alone, too poised, too self-assured. Laura had skimmed the morning briefings about a series of thefts in the neighborhood. No specific suspect description was given, only vague references to a black male spotted nearby. But her intuition told her this particular woman, didn't fit here. It wasn't something she could explain. It was just a hunch. Her grip tightened on the radio at her side as she slowed her pace, observing Emily from a distance. The woman wasn't doing anything unusual, just reading. But that was the issue. Why was she here in this predominantly white area, alone on a weekday afternoon? Was she waiting for someone, scouting the location? Laura had seen it before, individuals pretending to be ordinary bystanders while secretly plotting their next move. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Laura exhaled, adjusted her belt, and strode toward the bench, her polished boots clicking against the pavement with determination. "Ma'am," she called out, her tone steady but firm. Emily turned the page of her book without glancing up. "Ma'am," Laura repeated, this time sharper, more insistent. Emily looked up, her expression calm but attentive. "Can I help you?" she asked, closing her book with a soft thud. She was no stranger to encounters like this, no stranger to the weight of a suspicious stare. It had happened too often before, and she had learned to recognize the signs. An officer approaching with rigid posture, a tone that carried just enough authority to demand compliance, but not enough to warrant genuine concern. "I need to see some identification," Laura said, shifting her weight slightly, one hand resting near her belt. Emily blinked, her lips pressing into a thin line before she responded. "Why?" Laura's jaw tightened at the simple question. Most people complied immediately. They didn't ask why. They didn't challenge her. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area," she said, her tone clipped and professional. Emily tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth barely curving in what might have been amusement or irritation. It was hard to tell. "Suspicious activity?" she echoed. "And what exactly makes me suspicious?" Laura stiffened at the pushback. "I'm just doing my job, Mom. You match the general description of a suspect seen in the area." "And that description is?" Emily pressed. Laura hesitated for a split second. "A black individual." The words felt hollow, even as she spoke them, but she stood by them. Emily let out a slow breath, nodding as if she had just confirmed something to herself. "Right," she muttered. She had options here. She could comply, hand over her ID, let this officer feel like she had done her job and go about her day. Or she could assert her rights and see how deep this officer was willing to dig herself into this hole. She made her choice. "Am I being detained?" Laura exhaled sharply, the tension in her shoulders tightening. "I need you to cooperate." "I asked you a question," Emily replied evenly. "Am I being detained?" You're refusing to comply with a lawful order, Laura snapped, her patience wearing thin. I need to confirm who you are. You need to confirm who I am, Emily repeated. Because I'm reading a book? Laura didn't respond immediately. The longer this conversation went on, the less control she felt she had over it. People in the park had begun to take notice. A few passers-by slowed down, their eyes darting between the two women. Someone held up their phone, recording. The scrutiny only made Laura dig her heels in deeper. Stand up, she ordered, her hand moving instinctively toward her holster. Emily remained still. Are you seriously reaching for your gun? She asked, her voice quieter now, almost disbelieving. Stand up. Hands where I can see them. Emily sighed, realizing there was no easy way out of this. If she resisted, even verbally, she knew how this could go. The headline wrote itself, Black Woman Resists Arrest in City Park. It didn't matter that she was a federal agent. It didn't matter that she had done nothing wrong. In that moment, none of it mattered. Slowly, she placed her book on the bench beside her and rose to her feet, moving deliberately, careful not to make any sudden gestures. I'm not resisting, she said, her tone even, but I do want to be clear. I have done nothing wrong. Laura ignored the words, grabbing for her wrist, twisting it behind her back with a practiced grip. The metal cuffs snapped around Emily's wrists, tight enough to sting. A murmur rippled through the bystanders. A voice from the crowd called out, Why are you arresting her? She didn't do anything. Laura kept her head high, ignoring the onlookers. Suspect is in custody, she muttered into her radio. Emily clenched her jaw as she was led toward the waiting patrol car. Her heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of anger. Anger at the predictability of this situation, at the exhaustion of constantly being seen as a threat before being seen as a person. As she was placed into the back seat of the vehicle, she stared straight ahead, silent, unmoving. She could already see where this was going. Soon, Officer Laura Bennett would know exactly who she had just arrested, and when she did, Emily would be watching, waiting, ready. The drive to the precinct was tense, the hum of the engine filling, the silence between them. Emily sat in the back of the patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her, her expression unreadable as she gazed out the window. She wasn't worried. She knew how this would end, but she couldn't ignore the familiar weight of frustration pressing down on her. She had worked too hard, climbed too high in her career, only to find herself back in this all-too-familiar position, judged first, questioned later. Laura Bennett sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, sneaking glances at Emily through the rearview mirror. Something about the woman's demeanor unsettled her. Most people in this situation would be nervous, pleading their innocence, or at the very least, throwing out excuses. Emily Davis was doing none of those things. She was just sitting there, quiet, composed, like she knew something Laura didn't. The realization made Laura's stomach twist uncomfortably. They arrived at the precinct, the tires screeching slightly. As Laura pulled into the lot, she stepped out quickly, walked around to the back door, and yanked it open. Let's go, she said, reaching for Emily's arm. Emily didn't resist. She stepped out calmly, straightening to her full height, meeting Laura's gaze with quiet authority. Laura looked away first. The lobby of the precinct was a familiar whirlwind of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and low murmurs of conversation. Officers bustled around, some barely glancing up, others casting curious looks in their direction. Laura led Emily toward the processing desk, where Officer Thompson, a young officer barely 2 years into the job, sat behind the counter typing up paperwork. He looked up as they approached. "What's this about?" Thompson asked, glancing at Emily and then at Laura, caught her loitering. "Refuse to show ID," Laura replied, reaching for Emily's wallet from the evidence tray. She tossed it onto the counter. Thompson picked it up, flipping it open. The moment he saw the name, his fingers froze over the keyboard. His eyes darted between the ID and Emily's face, then back to the ID. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Officer Bennett, he said cautiously, his voice lower now. Are you sure about this? Laura frowned. Of course, I'm sure. I wouldn't have brought her in otherwise. Thompson hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. You might want to check the credentials, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Annoyed, Laura snatched the wallet from his hand, her eyes scanning the ID for the first time since she'd taken it. The moment she saw the words Federal Bureau of Investigation, her breath caught. Special Agent Emily Davis, FBI. Her fingers tightened around the leather wallet as her pulse spiked. This had to be a mistake. She had spent years trusting her instincts, and they had never failed her before, but this wasn't just a misstep, this was a catastrophe. Laura lifted her eyes to Emily, who stood there completely calm, watching her, waiting. Thompson cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Captain Harris is going to want to hear about this. Laura barely heard him. A cold sweat broke out along the back of her neck as the weight of what she had just done sank in. Before she could say anything, a commanding voice cut through the tension. What the hell is going on here? Captain Rachel Harris strode toward them, her sharp eyes flicking between Emily and Laura. She was a seasoned officer, well respected, known for being fair but strict. Laura had worked under her for years now. As Harris's gaze settled on the handcuffs around Emily's wrists, Laura felt her stomach drop. Officer Bennett, why is this woman in cuffs? Harris demanded, her tone leaving no room for nonsense. Laura opened her mouth, searching for the right words, but Emily beat her to it. Captain, she said smoothly, lifting her restrained hand slightly. Apparently, I was reading too suspiciously. In the park. Her tone was light, but the underlying sting was unmistakable. Harris's eyes darkened. Take those cuffs off her. Now. Laura hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled for the key. She unlocked the cuffs, stepping back as Emily rubbed her wrists. Captain, Laura started, but Harris cut her off with a glare that could freeze steel. My office. Now. Emily didn't move as Laura turned and followed Harris down the hall, her stomach twisting tighter with each step. Inside the office, Harris shut the door with more force than necessary. Laura stood stiffly in front of the desk, her hands clasped behind her back, in a poor attempt to hide the nervous tremble in her fingers. Explain, Harris demanded. Laura swallowed, straightening her spine. She was in the park, alone, fit. The general description of, "Don't insult my intelligence, Bennett," Harris snapped. You profiled her. You didn't have probable cause, and you just arrested a federal agent on nothing but a gut feeling. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've just landed us in? Laura clenched her jaw. I was following my training. No, you weren't, Harris shot back. You let your bias lead you into making a career-ending mistake. Laura flinched at the words. Career-ending. Was it really that bad? Captain, I didn't know who she was, she argued, but even she heard the weakness in her voice. And that's the problem, Harris said, her tone quieter now but no less severe. It shouldn't have mattered. Her identity shouldn't be the reason you're realizing this was wrong. Laura had no response to that. A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence. Harris exhaled sharply. Come in. Emily stepped inside, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, assessing the room like she was still gathering intelligence. Captain, she greeted, mind if I have a word with Officer Bennett? Harris hesitated, then nodded. I'll give you two a moment. She shot Laura a warning look before exiting the office. The door clicked shut, leaving Laura and Emily alone. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Laura looked anywhere but at Emily. Finally, Emily spoke. I'm not here to gloat, she said, but I do want to understand something. What exactly made you think I was dangerous? Laura swallowed, her throat dry. I was acting on instinct. Emily arched a brow. Instinct? She repeated. Interesting. Tell me, if I had been blonde, wearing yoga pants, drinking a latte, would your instincts have reacted the same way? Laura flinched. She had no good answer to that. I wasn't trying to discriminate, to harass an innocent person. Because that's exactly what you did. The only reason this is ending differently is because of my job title. And that, Officer Bennett, is the real problem. Laura clenched her fists. I don't need a lecture. No, Emily said, tilting her head. You need a reality check and maybe a little self-reflection. Another silence. Laura hated the way Emily looked at her, not with anger, but with disappointment. It was worse, somehow. You made a mistake, Emily continued. A serious one. The question is, are you going to learn from it? Laura exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over her face. I don't know, she admitted. I've been a cop for 15 years. I thought I knew how to read people. Maybe it's time to rethink that. Emily nodded. Maybe it is. A knock at the door signaled Captain Harris's return. Laura, you're being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The words hit Laura like a gut punch, but she nodded stiffly. Emily turned to Harris. I'd like to assist with training at this precinct. There's clearly work to be done. Harris nodded. I'd appreciate that. Emily glanced at Laura one last time. It's not too late to change. But that choice is yours. Laura remained silent as Emily left the room. For the first time in her career, she wondered if she was really as good a cop as she had always believed. Captain Harris's office felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in as Laura sat stiffly in the chair across from her. The air was heavy, thick with tension, and Laura felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She had been in this office countless times before, but never like this, never with the certainty that she was the one in the wrong. Harris sat behind her desk, hands clasped together, staring at Laura with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and exhaustion. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? She asked, her voice steady but firm. Laura swallowed hard, nodding slightly but saying nothing. There was nothing to say. Harris sighed, shaking her head. You arrested a federal agent with no probable cause. You detained her based on nothing, more than a gut feeling, a feeling rooted in bias, whether you want to admit it or not. The words stung, but Laura kept her face impassive. She had spent years believing she was a good cop, that her instincts were sharp, her judgment sound. But sitting here, replaying the events in her mind, she couldn't deny that she had let something else guide her actions. And now she was paying for it. A knock at the door broke the silence, and Harris called for the visitor to enter. Emily. Davis stepped inside, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, calculating. Laura tensed, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Emily had every right to be furious, to demand punishment, to throw Laura's mistake back in her face. Instead, she simply looked at Harris and said, Mind if I speak with Officer Bennett alone? Harris hesitated, glancing between them before nodding. I'll give you two a few minutes. She rose from her chair and left the room, the door clicking shut behind her. Silence settled between them, thick and uncomfortable. Emily didn't sit. She leaned against the desk, arms crossed, studying Laura like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Laura hated the way it made her feel, like she was under a microscope, like every flaw, every misstep was being laid bare. I'm not here to lecture you, Emily finally said. I think you already know where you went wrong. Laura exhaled sharply, looking away. I made a mistake, a big one. One that could have gone a lot worse if I had reacted differently, Emily corrected. That was the part that haunted Laura the most. She had seen situations like this escalate in ways that ended with tragedy. If Emily hadn't been who she was, if she had reacted even slightly differently, things could have spiraled into something irreversible. I don't know what you want me to say, Laura admitted, her voice quieter now. Emily studied her for a long moment before responding. I don't need you to say anything. I need you to think, to ask yourself why your first instinct was to see me as a threat, to ask yourself how many times you've let that instinct guide you and how many innocent people have suffered because of it. Laura clenched her jaw. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, to insist that she wasn't like that she wasn't racist, that she wasn't one of those cops. But the truth was, intent didn't matter. The impact did. And the impact of her actions today had been crystal clear. Emily pushed off the desk and straightened. This isn't about one mistake, Officer Bennett. It's about a pattern, and the only way to break it is to acknowledge it. Laura met her gaze, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to really hear what Emily was saying. She had spent her entire career believing she was fair, that she treated everyone equally. But had she? Or had she simply convinced herself of that because it was easier than facing the truth? Before she could answer, the door opened and Harris re-entered. Her expression was unreadable as she settled back into her chair. Laura, effective immediately, you're being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The words hit Laura like a physical blow, but she nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She had expected this. She deserved this. Understood, Captain, she said, keeping her voice steady. Harris turned to Emily. You mentioned you wanted to assist with training at this precinct. Emily nodded. If you'll have me, it's clear there's work to be done. Harris exhaled, nodding in agreement. That would be appreciated. Emily turned back to Laura. It's not too late to change, she said, her tone softer now. But that choice is yours. Laura didn't respond right away. She sat there, staring at the desk, grappling with the uncomfortable realization that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure of herself. She had spent years believing she was doing the right thing, but today had cracked that foundation. She didn't know if she could change, but for the first time, she wondered if she should try. As Emily left the office, Laura remained seated, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She wasn't sure she was ready to confront the truth. The precinct bustled outside the door, officers moving about, carrying on as if nothing had happened. But for Laura Bennett, everything had changed, and for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure where she stood.